What's the point in pattern making if you can't actually bring your own designs to life? So this video is a bit different from my other pattern making videos because today I'm going to focus on sewing and showing you how to sew your own flared or circle skirt. And the best part is it's completely your own design. Hi, welcome to Pattern Making with Lee. Full disclosure, making your own clothes does take some time and it can be a bit overwhelming when you're starting out, but good news is skirts are one of the easier things to make, so I've only got a couple of seams and a hem. Plus I've also broken it down to 3 stages. I'm going to walk you through every single step. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do French seams with pockets. Because pockets are the best and everything should have them. And if you're thinking, ooh, pockets with French seams, don't worry, it's easier than you think. And I'll walk you through each part of the process. And with French seams, yes, they may seem to take a bit longer, but as you get better at them, they're actually a much nicer, cleaner finish. And as you get more practice, you'll be able to start using French seams on beautiful organzas and silks and crepes. So they do get easier as you practice, and they are a beautiful finish, so it's worthwhile getting the skill in your belt. But with French seams, remember you've got to have a 1.2 centimetre or ½ inch seam allowance, not 1 centimetre. It needs to be slightly bigger. Then I'll show you how to attach your waistband and invisible zipper. Doing an invisible zip with a French seam is one of the more awkward sewing finishes and transitions. I've got some tips to make it as easy as possible. And last but not least, I'll show you how to finish a hem with a facing. And I'm going to put some crinoline tape in my facing. Crinoline tape is just a great sort of sewing hack that a lot of high-end designers use. We definitely use it a lot at McQueen. Just to give your dresses and skirts more volume, it just pushes the fabric out a bit and gives more structure and support. So give it a go on your design. And speaking of designs, let's grab our patterns and start sewing. If you haven't made your own pattern yet, watch the video, it's just popped up. It will show you how to create any flared or circle skirt using a lot less mass than other circle skirt videos. My approach is to give you control over how much and where you add volume, because where you add the volume completely changes the silhouette of your skirt. So give it a go. It's quite a simple approach. You're definitely able to do it, and you're able to make something really beautiful that's your own design. So make your pattern and come back and join us. Grab your pattern and cut it out on your chosen fabric. Make sure you wash and iron your fabric first too. Waistband patterns need to be fused, and it's best to block fuse your fabric first and then cut the pattern. This is much easier than cutting the fuse and fabric separately and then ironing them together afterwards. And once you've cut all your pieces, you can start sewing. French seams are essentially sewn twice. The raw edge of the first seam is encased within the second seam. It's a very neat and clean finish. And fun fact about French seams, French ateliers refer to this seam as couture anglaise, which means English seam. French seams are perfect for any sort of sheer or lightweight fabrics like organza and silk. And they're also great, they give a really nice clean finish for medium weight fabrics like linen and cotton. I'm using linen for my skirt. However, because the seam is essentially sort of 4 layers of fabric doubled up together, it can get quite bulky, so I wouldn't use it for heavy fabrics or any sort of wool. So for heavy fabrics, you just do a straight stitch and overlock or bow into the seam. French seams are also, they're a bit hard to get around curves, so if you have got very curved parts of your skirt somewhere, sew the first seam, remember there are 2 seams, and then follow these tips. Trim the first seam allowance. You would usually trim the seam allowance in half after you sew the first seam, but for curved seams, trim the seam allowance even more so you're much closer to the stitching. This will allow you to bend and manipulate the fabric more as you start to curve it. Tip number 2, press and pin in small sections. If fabric is fighting you, press what you can and then pin it in place, and then move on to the next section. Then sew your second seam slowly. It's really easy for puckering to occur around curves, so check what you're sewing as you go. And if there's some puckering, don't worry, just unpick that section, so maybe 2 or 3 centimeters, so 1 inch either side of the puckering. Smooth it out, give it a good press, and resew it. Step 1. With wrong sides of the fabric together, pin the seams together. 2. Using a straight stitch, sew a seam at a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure your seam too. 3. Trim the seam allowance in half. Be careful not to leave any threads. This is a good habit to get into so they don't poke through the finished seam. 4. Fold the fabric with right sides together, press the seam flat so you have a really nice clean edge. 5. Pin the seam in place to make it easier to sew. 6. Using a straight stitch, sew a second line of stitching with a 6mm, so 1/4 inch seam allowance, and your raw edge should be inside. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end to secure your seam too. 7. Press the seam to one side to finish. But my side seams have pockets, so I need to attach these first. We're going to start by stitching along our pocket opening. So step 1, Pin one of your pocket bags to the front of your skirt with right sides of the fabric together. My pocket extends all the way to the top, so I'm going to pin and then sew along here to the bottom notch, which is where my pocket opening ends. But if your pocket starts here, just stitch between your top notch, so where the opening starts, and the bottom notch, where the opening ends. Put a horizontal pin at the top and bottom of your opening, so you know where to stop. It's really important you finish at these notches and stitching doesn't extend beyond them. 2. Stitch along your pocket opening at the seam. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure your stitch too. 3. Open the pocket and iron the pocket opening edge with the seam underneath the pocket. 4. Edge stitch next to your seam, so right next to it, like 1/8 of an inch on the pocket side. This will help the pocket stay in place and stop it from rolling out when you wear it. Don't go beyond the pocket opening endpoint, otherwise you won't be able to do the French seam. Some people recommend stitching on top of the skirt or on both pocket bags. I don't want stitching to be visible, so I only do the top pocket bag, not both. But if you want to do both, feel free to do that. Just know that you probably will see the stitching. 5. Fold the seam and press along it, so you have a really nice sharp edge. 6. Place the other pocket bag behind with wrong sides of the fabric together and pin along the outer edges. I'm using horizontal pins at my pocket notches and then vertical pins in between. Horizontal is more accurate, but vertical gets the job done quicker. 7. Sew along the outer edge with a 6mm seam allowance. As I go around the base of my pocket, it's getting hard to go around the curves nicely, so with my needle in the fabric, I'm just stopping sewing and lifting the foot up and rotating the fabric. This just makes it a bit easier to go around the curves. 8. Trim your seam allowance in half. 9. Turn the pocket inside out and press along the edge of the seam. 10. Pin the seam in place to make it easier to sew. 11. Sew another row of stitching with a 6mm seam allowance, or 1/4 of an inch, along the pocket edge, and your pocket is done. Now that I've done my pocket, I can pin my skirt fabric with wrong sides together along the side seam. Then, I'll sew my side seam with a 6mm seam allowance, then trim that seam allowance in half, then fold the fabric so right sides are together and press along the edge so it's nice and crisp, and pin it in place. Then, I'll sew my second row of stitching with a 6mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I'll feel for the pocket opening as I go. You want to sew close to it, but don't go over it, otherwise you won't be able to access the pocket, so take your time. Press the seam to one side to finish. If you've got a side seam zipper, like me, it's usually in the left-hand side seam, so leave that one open. We need to insert the zip first, then do the side seam. So for now, completely finish your right side seam, so where the zipper isn't, and then the left one, just attach the pocket. And before we insert the zip, we need to attach the waistband. Before I attach the waistband to my skirt, I'll head over to the iron and fold my waistband along the fold line, using the notches at each end as a guide. The right side of the fabric should be visible, so you shouldn't be able to see any fusing. And I'm just pressing along the fold line, creating a nice sharp line. If you look carefully, you'll notice I'm not actually folding my waistband in half, like most people would, because I made one side of my waistband slightly wider. Why? To make stitching the ditch easier. I've done a whole video on how about stitching the ditch, what it is, and how to make it easier, where I share this pattern making hack and some other tips, so check that out. I'll leave a link to it in the description. I'm also going to press the seam allowance along one length of my waistband. If you decide to make your waistband wider, like mine on one side, press that side seam allowance up. And I'm using a ruler not to measure how big the seam allowance is, but make sure the waistband is the right width. There will always be cutting errors, and the important thing is the waistband is the right width, not that I have a perfect 1cm seam allowance folded. Now, let's attach the waistband. Grab your skirt and pin the length of the waistband that you didn't press the seam allowance on to your skirt. The right side of your skirt and waistband fabric should be facing in, so you should be able to see the fusing of the waistband on top. Once you finish pinning, you can sew along the seam. The seam allowance will be concealed inside the waistband, so let's press it up towards the waistband. You should always press each seam open or closed after you sew it. While it may seem like a good idea to iron with the seam on top so you can see it, it's actually really easy for the waistband fabric or the skirt fabric to crumple underneath, and you won't be able to see it until you're finished and you have always ugly crease lines. So flip the skirt over so the right side of the waistband is visible, and before you press, just feel the seam is facing up towards the waistband and then press it. As you go, help push the fabric up with your fingers so the seam is pressed flat. Always check the fabric nearby is flat too. It's so easy to accidentally have the fabric crumpled, and then you put the iron down and squash it accidentally. Before we close the waistband, we need to insert our zip. And I'm going to touch my zip so it starts right at the top of my waistband. And the length of your zip will depend on how flared your skirt is. If you've got a really big voluminous circle skirt, the zip can finish about 10 centimeters from the waist. If your skirt is sort of like a 90-degree flared skirt, it'll need to be a bit longer, so about 18 centimeters from the waist. And just so you know, you don't finish the zip at the bottom of the zip tape. You usually finish the zip about 3 or 4 centimeters from the zipper end point. So I'm using a 20 centimeter zip, so I'm going to finish my zip on the skirt at 17 centimeters. I've ironed some medium weight fusing along the edge here to give the seam some extra strength, but make sure you only put it in the seam allowance though. Before I insert the zip, I want to sew the rest of the seam below it. So I'll find my zipper end notch and pin the front and back side seams together below it, with the wrong side of the fabric facing together, because I'm doing a French seam. If your fabric has a print, try and match it by putting horizontal pins at the key points of the design, like the top of a big stripe. And once you've marked those, put more vertical pins in between. Now we're going to sew our French seam, and this is always a bit of an awkward junction when the invisible zip meets the French seam, and I should give a little shout out to Generally M Patterns for still a pattern making hack. So what we're going to do is sew our French seam, and at the top we're going to go up at slightly at an angle. Sew your 6mm seam allowance, and when you're about 6mm or a quarter of an inch from the top, stop with your needle in the fabric, lift your machine foot, and turn the fabric 45 degrees and sew it at an angle, finishing in line with the zipper end notch, and remember to backstitch. And put a small snip to the top of the angle and trim the seam allowance slightly. Trim your seam allowance in half, push and flip the seam towards the inside. There should be a little angle at the top here, and press along the edge so it's nice and sharp. Then pin along the edge of the fabric and do your second row of straight stitching with the 6mm seam allowance. The seam should finish at the top of the angle. Press the seam to one side to finish. Now we can insert our zip. Press the seam allowance open where the zip will be inserted. Now, let's position our zip to sew it. The plastic bit should be at the top. Now the edge may look like it's here, but you can actually open the zip up a little bit, so roll it over. Really push the teeth out of the way, otherwise you'll see part of the zip. Then pin the zip so the crease here is on the seam allowance edge you've pressed open. If you're new to sewing, not feeling very confident about sewing a visible zip, just get a second one and practice on some scrap fabric. You could also do what is called a basting stitch along the zipper tape here first. A basting stitch is a temporary stitch used to hold layers of fabric together when you're sewing to prevent it from moving around. The stitch length is usually larger, so it's easy to remove, but you can keep the basting stitch on a zipper tape. It'll help to secure the tape to the fabric more. I've switched my machine foot, so now I've got a regular zipper foot on. This will allow you to get close to the zipper. Once I've done my basting stitch, I'll check my waistband seams match and the zip is looking good. It's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to do the proper final stitch right next to the zipper, and to make it easier, I'm going to switch to my invisible zipper foot. You can use a regular zipper foot, but rather than putting the foot on top of the zipper teeth, you'll put it right next to it. If you're using a normal zipper foot, roll the zipper teeth out as you go so you can get right in the valley there. Make sure you backstitch at your seams at the beginning and end too, so it doesn't unravel. And once you've done both sides of the zip, carefully pull the slider and pull tab above the zipper finishing line. And check your waistband seams match, and you can open your pocket. Now, I'll press the fabric away from the zip. This will stop the fabric from getting caught in the zip and to give the skirt a nice finish. I'm just pulling the seam slightly as I go. The fabric along my zipper tape hasn't been finished, so I need to add some binding along the edge of the zipper tape that will cover the raw edge of the fabric. Ideally, this binding would be in a matching lightweight fabric like a lining, but I didn't have any, so I used my self fabric. I will do a proper tutorial on bias binding, but essentially I just cut diagonal strips of fabric about 2.4 centimeters or 1 inch wide, then pressed in half, then in half again. Then I pinned and stitched one side of the binding to the zipper tape, making sure it was close enough to the edge so I can fold the binding around the tape. Then I folded the binding around the zipper tape, making sure the raw edges of the binding were enclosed, and then stitched along the edge. This is a really nice, clean way to finish your zipper tape. It's how high-end designers would do it. Now the zip is in, we can finish the waistband. Now, with the right side of the fabric facing towards me, I'll pull the zip extension down an angle so it's sandwiched between the zipper tape and the waistband seam allowance. Then, I'll fold the other side of the waistband on top so the right sides are together and you can see the fusing of the waistband. Pull the waistband fabric to the edge and make sure the seam allowance along the edge of the waistband, which you've already ironed, is folded up. Then, with your zipper foot on, you can stitch along the width of the waistband. It's best to do a basting stitch along the tape first, then do a second row of stitching next to zipper stitching, so it's just inside the seam allowance. Once you've finished stitching, trim the seam allowance at the corner here. This will reduce the bulk and help you get a really sharp corner. Repeat these steps on the other side of the waistband, then flip the waistband right side out and press the seam. If it's a bit bulky, you can trim the seam allowance some more. Now it's time to stitch in the ditch, and if you use a zipper foot, keep that one on so you can get right on top of the seam. Feel free to do a basting stitch first if you want, but I'm feeling pretty confident because I made my waistband pattern slightly wider on that side, so I'm just going to insert lots of pins and go really slowly and make sure I can feel the folded edge underneath. The bulk should be consistent. If it starts to feel thinner, it means your fabric has slipped. While I'm sewing, I'm also pulling the waistband and skirt fabric out as I go. The idea is to get almost on top of the seam, so when the fabric is released and sitting normally, it will help to cover the seam for you. Once I've finished stitching the ditch, the waistband will be attached, which means the top half will be done. But before I can finish the hem and add my facing, I need to let the fabric drop on the bias. So I'll put my skirt on my mannequin, and I've attached the crinoline tape along the hem to give it a bit of extra weight so it will drop more, and I'll go to bed and come back 24 hours later. Amending my pattern for the bias would be relatively easy if I had a straight hem, because I would let it drop and then mark the correct length on my skirt and then just trim it. However, I've got an uneven hem, so rather than using one length across the skirt, I need to know how long it is at certain points. But luckily, I've got these notches along the hem of my skirt to attach my facing, and I'm going to measure the length from these points to my waist and mark that on my skirt. When you measure the length, your measuring tape needs to meet the waist seam at a 90-degree angle, because this is the way the fabric will fall. The waist seam is straight in the end, right? So to go directly straight down, the line needs to be 90 degrees. And I'm including my hem seam allowance in my measurement, so it's really easy to measure on my mannequin. And these are all my measurements. And 24 hours later, I'll remove my crinoline tape and start checking my skirt length. So I'm just looking for the notches along the hem and measuring directly up. And I've got my pattern on the floor here, so I can see how long each section should be. If it isn't the same length, so that part is on the bias, I'll mark the correct length with my marker. And usually I would trim on the mannequin, but I'm not feeling confident with all these curves, so I'll remove it and put my pattern on top. So I've got my skirt, I'm just pinning the pattern on top. You'll notice I've got some pins here. I did use a purple vanishing marker to mark the points, but I don't know if it's the humidity or the fabric. But once I removed the skirt from the mannequin, all the marks were gone, so I had to redo it with pins. And I'm just laying my pattern on top, so the notches along the hem match up with their corresponding pin. Then, I'll trim along the edge. You can kind of check your work as you go. Make sure the part that you're removing the most from is actually on the bias. Also, just a side note, my hem length did end up becoming a bit shorter, so I had to take a bit off the facing at the seams. It's not that I did anything wrong, it's just that when we take the bias into account, we need to adjust the pattern and also any patterns that are attached to it, like the facing. Now that my hem has taken the bias into account, I can attach my facing. If you're sewing traditional facings, the facing is inside the skirt and not visible. What you do is pin the facing to the skirt so the right sides are together, and then sew along the seam, then fold it inside out so the seam is concealed inside the facing, give it a good press, and then stitch it to the skirt. However, I'm using my facing a design detail. It's going to go on top of my skirt. So I'm going to pin my facing with the right side of the fabric facing the wrong side of my skirt fabric, and I'll pin it in place. I finished pinning, and as I mentioned before, I had to make my facings a bit shorter because I adjusted the hem for the bias, and you can see the difference here. Before I sew the facing to the skirt, I'll just sew the facings together at the side seams. Then sew along the hem with a 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once I'm done sewing, I'll fold the facing up and press along the edge so I have a nice crisp line. Then I'm going to press my 1 centimeter seam allowance at the top of my facing. This will just make it much easier to sew. Like I did with the waistband, I'm using my ruler to measure the width of the facing rather than the length of my seam allowance. Full disclosure, pressing the hem of a big circular skirt does take time, and essentially you have to do it twice. But taking the time to press it beautifully now will make it so much easier to sew later and give it a nice, clean, crisp finish. I'm almost done, but before I attach my facing to my skirt, I'm going to pin it in place while I insert the crinoline. And my crinoline tape is about 3.2 centimeters, so it's a bit smaller than my 5 centimeter facing. I'll need to bend the crinoline tape around the curves, and I'll put some pins in to hold it in place. See how I'm putting the tape in, holding it in place with my fingers, putting the facing on top, and then putting a pin through all the layers. Once I finish pinning, I'll stitch a line right next to the edge here, about 3 millimeters max or 1/8 of an inch from the edge on my facing side. Then I'll give my facing and skirt a final press, and I'm done. And that's how you sew a flared or circle skirt with French seams, pockets, waistband, visible zip, and facing. So we did cover a lot in this video, and if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, don't worry, these are not the easiest finishes, but they are beautiful, and if you're going to be making your own clothes regularly, they're worthwhile getting good at. However, if you are new to sewing, I would recommend using more sort of durable medium weight fabrics like linen and cotton when you're starting off. Silks and lightweight fabrics, they slip around quite a lot, so start with the more medium weight ones like the linen like I use, and then work your way up to the silks and crepes. If you need more pattern cutting help, head to my website, CLIQDPatternKits.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Then I'll send you the 10-step pattern checklist I use before sending my patterns to production, as well as a discount code to get 10% off your first CLIQD Pattern Kit order. I've got lots more pattern making and sewing videos coming up, so subscribe to my channel to learn how to bring your designs to life.